how do you say, roundtable discussion, um, allow me to give a few words on the event. So the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, also known as EDCA, was signed by representatives of the Philippine and the United States governments in 2014 as an effort to firm up the defense partnership between the two countries. Touted as a key pillar in the US-Philippine alliance, which involves, quote, training, exercises, and interoperability between the two countries' military forces. The EDCA also raises some concerns that in the event of actual conflict between China and the US over tensions in the Taiwan Strait, the Philippines will be necessarily embroiled. These concerns really are heightened with the recent designation of our 4 additional EDCA sites, which many analysts argue may become targets for preemptive attacks by hostile forces, thus inevitably dragging the Philippines into conflict. We are therefore holding this online roundtable discussion to try to flesh out the issues arising from the continuation and expansion of EDCA, as well as, of course, the implications to the security of the country and of the region. We are immensely honored by the presence of our resource persons in this virtual discussion. So I don't want to keep you waiting. Without further ado, I would like to call on our Dean, Dr. Hindelito Sevilla, for the opening remarks. Dean?
Maraming salamat, Professor Palombarit. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. To our esteemed speakers, Dr. Melissa Luha, my good friend, Dr. Chester Cabalsa, Mr. Herman Laurel, Dr. Henry Chan, Assistant Professor Idse Ibarra, colleagues and students, friends of UP Asian Center. Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. Welcome to our UP Asian Center webinar series. The University of the Philippines Asian Center is once again honored to receive our pool of experts today in a roundtable discussion on precarious times, EDCA, peace and stability, and the Philippines and beyond. As our country is strategically situated in an important maritime route between Asia, the Pacific, and other regional economies in the world, the Philippines has always been a vital consideration in the strategic calculation of regional and global powers, particularly in terms of protecting and preserving their interest, as well as in terms of protecting the interest of their allied countries in these regions. The geographical location in which the Philippines is found may be considered to be a blessing, while at the same time could be a curse, probably, to the country and to the nation. It is a blessing because the Philippines serves as a gateway to Asia, of Asia to the Pacific. It can play a vital role in the maintenance of regional and international security and peace, and also in terms of contributing positively to the facilitation of international trade and commerce, while at the same time, the country is benefiting also from the economic interactions of regional and global powers. The ability of the country to take advantage of these opportunities to benefit from the inter and intra-regional trade and economic transactions is ideally good for the Philippines. On the other hand, geographically or geography will only become a curse when the country is unable to defend itself from the potential threats. And given the strategic value of the country's geography to the region, the Philippines has also been exposed or vulnerable to regional and global threats, power rivalries, and other regional insecurities. Moreover, the strategic value attached to the country's geography. In view of the rising China, the U.S. return to the Asia-Pacific region, the China-U.S. rivalries have exposed the Philippines in a very difficult situation. The dilemma being is how would the Philippines under the Marcos administration take advantage of the economic benefits from China, at the same time benefit from the security, political, and economic opportunities from the United States. Thus, in the presence of the competing powers, how would the current administration of the President Marcos projects and articulates the national interests of the Philippines and the country's foreign policy? Today's roundtable discussion will give due consideration to discussing the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, which was signed in 2014 and which, according to the website of the U.S. Department of Defense on Feb 1, 2023, and was also mentioned by our moderator, Dr. Palumbarit, and I quote, that EDCA is the key pillar of the U.S.-Philippine alliance, which supports combined training, exercises, and interoperability between the two forces, meaning the United States and the Philippines. And I add on, and I quote, expansion of the EDCA will make our alliance stronger and more resilient, and will accelerate modernization of our combined military presence capabilities. However, as mentioned in the concept note of this roundtable, there have been reasonable, and I quote, concerns that needed to be addressed, such as the use of areas and facilities, and the proximity to Taiwan Strait, the presence of U.S. personnel and equipment, which may pose, I quote, a significant threat to the country in the event of U.S. involvement in tension, and I close quote, among others. Ladies and gentlemen, to better understand the given issue, I think, and I really look forward that a well-rounded discussion can emerge in today's roundtable, discussing not only the criticisms or the weaknesses of EDCA, but also the merits or the strengths behind EDCA, as well as the recent U.S. defense agreement within the framework of EDCA. Thank you very much for listening. Back to you, Michelle.
Yes, thank you, Sir Sevilla, for your insightful remarks. Like you, our resource persons and our attendees, of course, are looking forward to a meaningful exchange. At this point, let me call my colleague, Dr. Noel Christian Muratilla, to introduce our distinguished speakers and reactor. Noel?
Thank you, Michelle, Dr. Palumbarit. This event could not have come at a more opportune time because as per the agreement itself, it will continue automatically beyond the 10th year of implementation if neither party, if neither the US nor the Philippines takes steps towards its termination. If either party deems it wise to terminate the agreement, it should be done not later than April 27 of this year, which is no longer far off because of the one-year notice. We are therefore boundlessly honored to have with us our distinguished resource persons from the academe, the judiciary, and the media who will help us navigate the issue. Dr. Melissa Hubahib-Loha is the author of the book International Agreements Between Non-State Actors as a Source of International Law, published by Hart Bloomsbury in 2022. She has also authored various peer-reviewed articles in top international law journals such as American Society of International Law Proceedings, published by the Cambridge University Press, European Journal of International Law, published by Oxford University Press, International Journal of Constitutional Law, published by Oxford University Press, Leiden Journal of International Law, also published by Cambridge University Press, Ocean Development and International Law, published by Routledge, and the Journal of the History of International Law, published by Brill Nijok. She earned her Master of Laws with honors and PhD with honors from the University of Hong Kong and completed her postdoctoral fellowship at National University of Singapore. She has also won the Willoughby Prize for Best Research article published in the Journal of Energy and Natural Resources, Law, published by Taylor and Francis, and the Lee Ka-shing Prize for the best PhD thesis. We also have Professor Dr. Chester B. Cabalza, who is the founder and president of the Manila-based think tank International Development and Security Cooperation, also known as IDSC, and teaches in the Graduate School of the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He advises national leaders, multinational companies, and embassies on defense and security issues. He previously held the position of vice president for the research of for the Center of Research, rather, and Strategic Studies, while he concurrently became the Executive Fellow at the Development Academy of the Philippines. He was formerly a consultant of the World Bank and the Japan International and Cooperative Agency. He has also been recognized as scientist by the Department of Science and Technology under the Presidential Decree 997. He was a recipient of the CHED Faculty Development Scholarship and the Angara Scholarship Awards in UP Diliman, and the SEASREP by the Japan Foundation. As an environmental reviewer of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, he has reviewed big ticket projects under the Build, and now the Build Better More programs, including railways, subways, mining projects, mega dams, expressways, and bridges. He is also a course director and thesis advisor of senior military and police officers at the National Defense College of the Philippines, Armed Forces of the Philippines Command and General Staff College, and the Philippine Public Safety College. A fellow of the College of Defense Studies at the National University in Beijing, China, in the U.S. State Department under the stewardship of the University of Delaware. He has also published 100 of articles in peer-reviewed journals, as well as book chapters and opinion editorial articles within the purview of security studies. He recently co-authored The Rise of Philippinization. Philippinization is not Finlandization. Professor Cabalza has also won the IFSSO International Prize for the Social Science Award and the Humanitarian Award from the Rotary Club. He is regularly interviewed by foreign and local media on the South China Sea, regional terrorism, national defense and security, and related international political economy issues. We're also fortunate to have with us Mr. Herman Camentong Chiu Laurel, a broadcast journalist who tackles issues related to the relations between the Philippines and China. He is a former columnist of the Daily Tribune and Opinion. He also previously served as columnist for Malaya. He has likewise been the recipient of the awards for promoting Philippines-China understanding, or APCO, for helping, and I quote, clarify the truth about the South China Sea dispute that has complicated diplomatic relations between the two countries to an inconvenient degree, end of quote. He has also served as host for Talk News TV and Journeys, Chronicles of Our Asian Century, both on Global News Network, as well as Ang Maestro at Iba Pa on Radyo Pilipinas 1. Leader of the Philippine Refugee Processing Center, also known as PRPC, which has been renamed as the Bataan Technology Park Incorporated during the administration of former President Corazon Aquino. Dr. Henry Chan earned his BS in Electrical Engineering from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, his Master of Science in Biopharmaceuticals from the University of New South Wales, and his PhD General Management from Singapore Management University. He is a Senior Visiting Research Fellow of Cambodia Institute for Cooperation and Peace, or CICP, with extensive research interests ranging from climate change to digital transformation to great power transition. He has also written many book chapters and articles on the challenges and opportunities in this age of power transition, with the Industrial Revolution as the primary driving force. In addition, he regularly contributes opinion or editorial articles to China Daily and Manila Times. And last but not the least, we have as our reactor, Assistant Professor Edsel Jan Ibarra of our own Department of Political Science of UP Diliman. He was previously with the University of the Philippines, Manila. He has also served as a Foreign Affairs Research Specialist and officer in charge of the Strategic, Territorial, and Maritime Issues Section at the Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies, Foreign Service Institute, which serves as the policy think tank of the Department of Foreign Affairs. He has also written policy inputs, general audience articles, and academic articles on Philippine territorial and maritime concerns, including the South China Sea disputes. And in 2021, he was recognized as Young Leader and U.S.-Philippine Alliance Next Generation Leader at the Pacific Forum in Honolulu, Hawaii. He has a wide array of research interests that includes Philippine foreign policy, territorial and maritime disputes, maritime security and ocean governance, and regional security. He obtained his master's degree in international studies and bachelor's degree in political science from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. I am confident that we shall have, based on the credentials that I just shared with you, we're going to have an exhilarating conversation this afternoon. Thank you very much. Back to you, Michelle.
Yes, thank you, Noel. Very impressive resumes of our resource persons indeed. So to get the ball rolling, we shall now listen to about 5 minutes of the opening statement from each of our resource persons. Okay, let's start with Dr. Loha, to be followed by Dr. Cabalsa, Sir Laurel, and Dr. Chan at the end. Okay, Dr. Loha, please.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I have to disclaim any association affiliation with any public or private organization. And this allows me the academic freedom to pursue very hard questions and to contemplate very painful answers about the situation. Geopolitically, of course, we need to understand that it would be naive as well as parochial to isolate the regional situation from the following global developments. One is the collapse of the nuclear disarmament legal framework. In, I think it was 2017, the United States withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty. Russia followed suit and also withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty. A particular instrument allowed for the inspection overflight in order to inspect and monitor compliance with certain disarmament measures. Thereafter, the United States withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And the following day, Russia withdrew also from the INF Treaty. Thereafter, and this is very recently, Russia withdrew or suspended the operation of START 2, while the United States technically has suspended START 2 since 2022 with the start of the sanctions on Russia. Now, what are the implications of this geopolitical situation on the regional scenario or the regional situation? We have to add to this situation also the collapse of the unipolar movement or the unipolar moment of the United States, as well as the failure of its liberal hegemonic foreign policy. And in its place, there is now a multipolar alternative international order, and the attractiveness or the influence of the realism of great power politics in the formulation of foreign policy is on the rise. Now, the hard questions that we need to ask, and which government, as well as media, and even the academe, except perhaps the Asian Center, have been avoiding to ask and to pursue are the following. What are the implications of the broader geopolitical development on the SES and ECS, East China Sea situation? And for this purpose, I shall adopt the analysis of Professor John Mersheimer. According to Mersheimer, and this is a dire prediction, the South China Sea and the East China Sea shall be the site of a limited nuclear, conventional, or autonomous weapons warfare. And the basis of Mersheimer are the following. First, of course, is the Thucydides trap. Now, we need to remember that the Thucydides trap is not actually about the inevitability of war. Rather, it is about the dangerous dynamics in the competition between great powers that could lead to war. And according to Mersheimer, this dynamics is characterized by a survival instinct of the power of the two great powers, as well as the 100 years of humiliation of China in its history. And these two are incentives for the two competing powers to engage in warfare. Now, the choice of the South China Sea and the East China Sea as the site of a limited nuclear, conventional, or autonomous weapons warfare is based on the following assessment of Mersheimer. First, it allows for risk management in the sense that the two great powers would not need to attack the mainland territory of the other. Moreover, their own people will not be sacrificed. Rather, risk management can take place by engaging in this warfare in a limited way in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. And moreover, they have this capacity, the military capability to engage in such warfare. Of course, there are counter arguments to this assessment, namely the theory of economic interdependence as well as a theory of nuclear deterrence, but these are matters that we can discuss later. The point is, the second hard question that we now need the media are not asking is, what then are the implications of EDCA on these dangerous dynamics? And here we have to look at the meaning of EDCA beyond 2014. By EDCA, I mean the EDCA after the collapse of the nuclear disarmament legal framework, in the sense that now we have provisions in EDCA which allow the United States to preposition weapons, conventional or nuclear weapons, in EDCA sites, because the Philippine government, under the terms of the current EDCA, has no right to inspect the prepositioning of these weapons. Now, of course, much of the commentary has focused on the sites or the locations of EDCA. For me, those are irrelevant. An EDCA site can be designated in Tawi-Tawi, and the same threat to our survival and our country would still exist, because the US can preposition weapons in Tawi-Tawi and therefore attract a counter strike, or perhaps a preemptive strike from any of the enemies of the United States. Now, going back to what the implications of EDCA, we only need to refer to history to understand the possible implications of this. And I refer to, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, as well as the Ukraine war. Remember that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Castro defended his decision to preposition Soviet weapons in Cuban territory by invoking deterrence. Now, Castro, of course, had suffered an attempted invasion funded and instigated by the United States, and this was the Bay of Pigs invasion. Castro survived, and therefore the motivation to seek a form of deterrence by inviting Soviet weapons in that territory. And we know the outcome of that reasoning of Castro in invoking deterrence, similar to the reasoning being invoked by the Philippine government, including President Marcos, who said that all these EDCA activities are purely deterrent, and that the Philippine government will not allow EDCA sites from being used to launch an attack on China or on any foreign state. But then, of course, we know that, or perhaps Marcos was not advised, or he did not read the terms of the EDCA provisions, which provides that the United States alone can make decisions regarding the use of weapons that are prepositioned in EDCA sites. And therefore, the reasoning of President Marcos seems to be following. As to the deterrence function of EDCA, we only need to look at what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, as well as the Ukraine war, to understand the possibilities or the scenarios that are possible from the pursuit of EDCA activities. Now, the third hard question that we need to consider has to do with possible scenarios, given that we have a security dilemma arising from the EDCA sites, or the prepositioning of weapons in EDCA sites, as well as the collapse of the nuclear disarmament legal infrastructure. And the first hard question that we need to contemplate and to ask ourselves whether we are prepared for the consequences, of course, is that if there is going to be a limited nuclear war in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. And obviously, there is no option for the Philippines when that scenario takes place or it materializes. The other milder scenario would be a full-scale conflict, which is only a civil war in Taiwan, in the sense that, which presupposes, of course, that the United States will not intervene, and therefore the Philippines and its EDCA sites will not be implicated in any such civil war. Now, of course, the option for the Philippines is to maintain its neutrality, and it's the only way that it can survive such calamity. And the other option is, of course, is to find a way to rescue our OFWs in Taiwan. Now, I heard some of the commentators saying that if there's going to be a civil war in Taiwan and whether or not the United States will step in, our OFWs can be rescued using the provisions of EDCA or using American vessels. I doubt very much whether that is even possible. If a US vessel will attempt to rescue our OFWs, even if that vessel claims to be undertaking a humanitarian mission, that vessel will be attacked. And therefore, EDCA is of no use to the Philippines and to our OFWs in case of a civil war in Taiwan. Now, the other scenario, of course, is a full-scale war where the US will be involved. Full-scale war in Taiwan. And in that instance, the Philippines will be a legitimate target by China in the tradition of the Caroline affair, because the Philippines is no longer a neutral state. Even if the Philippines would pronounce that it is a neutral state, the presence of American weapons and vessels in the Philippines would open these sites as legitimate targets by China in case of a full-scale war over Taiwan. Now, the milder scenarios would be a naval quarantine, similar to the naval quarantine that the United States adopted in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of course, if there's a naval quarantine or even a naval blockade undertaken by China, the United States will respond and therefore drag the Philippines into the conflict. Now, what is the option for the Philippines? For me, the best way for the Philippines to get away, to evade such fate, is to preempt the situation by undertaking the inspection itself. And this, under the current EDCA, this is not to inspect weapons based on the type of weapons that will be prepositioned by the United States. And I shall show later on during the Q&A the provisions that I'm talking about. Now, if there would be no such provision at the present time or in the revised EDCA, then the Philippines will not be able to prevent a naval quarantine or protect itself from a naval quarantine. Because if, for instance, the Philippines is able to inspect the type of weapons that are prepositioned, then it can make an objection even before China will undertake a naval quarantine or a naval blockade. Now, the other mild scenario would be the prepositioning of missiles on the artificial structures of China in the South China Sea. Of course, this is another escalation. This is a very possible scenario. And the only response or the possible response of the Philippines to such scenario is to pursue the COC and therefore manage any risks or conflicts that might arise if China will preposition missiles in those artificial structures in response, of course, to missiles being prepositioned by the United States in our EDCA sites. Of course, in that situation, we will find an exodus of investors, foreign investors in particular, who would consider the stalemate in the South China Sea too risky for their business. And in that situation, of course, the economy will greatly suffer. As it is already underwater, it will, of course, suffer even more. The other mild scenario that can arise from all these dynamics is if China, we heard recently that Malaysia and China will be negotiating a delimitation of their maritime claims. And this will include the maritime claims emanating from Sabah. Now, if an agreement is forged between the two countries, this will presuppose a recognition by China of the territorial sovereignty of Malaysia over Sabah. And this will be in retaliation, a form of retaliation to the Philippines' alliance with the United States. Now, are we able to manage that particular scenario? I believe that if we pursue the COC with ASEAN, perhaps we can still salvage the situation and make sure that any resolution of the maritime claims of Malaysia and China will not affect the status of our claim to Sabah. Now, of course, notwithstanding these scenarios, which are, of course, difficult to anticipate and therefore difficult to prepare for, we have to, as a government and as a country involved in this conflict, indirectly or directly, have to contemplate the situation where Taiwan wins, whether it's in a civil war or in an international conflict. If Taiwan wins, will Taiwan take over the islands that we are claiming for purposes of ensuring its security? How then will we respond to Taiwan in that situation? Now, what if China wins? What happens next? What will happen to our economic relations with China, given that we have been involved in an armed conflict with China? Now, what if US wins? That is all very good for us, but then we also have to contemplate the possibility that the US would need to maintain its presence permanently in the South China Sea, and that could mean turning the Philippines again into a military base, if not a military garrison. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Loha. Very insightful statements and bold statements on EDCA, actually. Okay, thank you, Dr. Loha. Now, let's go to Dr. Cabalza.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Michelle. Allow me to share my screen PowerPoint presentation. Okay, my contribution would be the perception of Filipinos about their national security. And since, of course, we are discussing about these precarious times, confronting national security, and with the EDCA. One moment. Okay, with the new core EDCA sites that we have, let's try to digest what are the security implications of all of this. I'm from Cagayan, and I know the geostrategic importance of my province. And two of the bases are from my province. And if you try to look at it, Balabac Island is the farthest end of Palawan, and for facing the West Philippine Sea. And this is an island. And it aims to fortify the West Philippine Sea. You have Camp Melchor de la Cruz, which is an army camp in Gamu, Isabela. That's beside my province in Cagayan. And then, of course, two of the bases, if not, one is Camilo Ocias, it's a naval camp. And of course, the Lalo Airport, it's a civilian airport. If you try to look at it, all of the three major services of the armed forces are well represented. You have the Navy, Army, and Air Force. And of course, we are talking about interoperability and collective deterrence for this matter. And let's see how security evolved basically in the Philippines and how it affected us in our policymaking on foreign policy and security policy. Of course, one of the giant thinkers when it comes to national security, I always use this as reference in my class at the National Defense College, is Barry Bizan. And he said that security is taken to be about the pursuit of freedom from threat. So the mere fact that you have that freedom from threat, it's a feeling. And the ability and states and societies to maintain their independent identity and their functional integrity against forces of change which they see as hostile. And right now, the feeling of the Philippines is that our neighbor is being hostile to us. That's the reason why we are building up this security concept that we have. It's not only a feeling, but it's also a state of mind and a material need. That's the reason why we are modernizing our armed forces. And we are now in the revitalized modernization program of the military at the third phase, which I will discuss later on. Okay. In 2013, I was still a tenured faculty at the National Defense College. This is one of the contributions that I made for the defense. I was like trying to understand what is the real concept of Filipinos when it comes to security. And it seems like there is now a real transition from internal security operations to territorial defense. That's the reason why, if you notice, most of the keywords, linguists would say that if the word exists in your society or in your culture, then that concept or that culture exists. And it seems like security exists in the Philippines, although it's episodic basically when it comes to strategic culture. And in here, you would see that there is a transition from internal to external. That's the reason why our president is now correcting the policy in our security policy that the task of the armed forces is to redirect them to territorial defense. And he said about EDCA that this will not be used for offensive action, but to bolster Philippine territorial defense initiatives, basically. And one of the reasons why we have to look at the situations around our region. I'm a fan of Vietnam, and I've been watching a lot of movies and war movies about the Vietnam War. And there's this one movie that I've seen when he says, when of course Ho Chi Minh was like saying that the reason, two of the reasons why the Vietnamese lost their war with France were their meek and weak foreign policy and their ignorance to changing geopolitical landscape. And I think that's the reason why we are trying to strengthen our foreign policy. And amidst this heightened power competition between these two superpowers in our own backyard. And of course, the reason why you have the EDCA sites now in the northern hemisphere of the northern zone, which is part of that first island chain, is to recognize the changing geopolitical landscape and regional security architecture in our region. Okay, now, because of this competition, the Philippines had achieved a certain status as a middle power. And the role of a middle power is to become a bridge builder, to negotiate. And of course, since we are trying to attract two superpowers in our region, which elevated us as a middle power, then middle power role works best in the ambiguity of great power politics. That's the reason why it took time for us to choose which power are we going to deal with. Of course, in the previous administration, we dealt with Beijing. Now we're dealing again with Washington. And of course, our foreign and security policy are still evolving. And that's what a middle power can do, basically, in us. Now, the foreign secretary, who is a multilateral expert, says that middle powers are states that neither great nor small. Of course, this comes from Lowy Institute of Australia. But all the while, he was like saying that we need to be more diplomatic and in the political space of our international engagements, because basically, if you try to look at qualifications of middle power when it comes to the military, the Philippines will not fit into that middle power. It just so happened that we have wide international relations network and we were able to attract two superpowers. That's the reason why we were included in that list of a middle power. And of course, like what I'm saying, a middle power becomes a bridge builder, and basically it becomes a balancer to have these constructive approaches to issues. Now, what happens to the Philippines, given that, of course, we have already allowed Americans to have operational bases in northern Philippines, of course, and especially now that we are in the third tranche of the revitalize AFP modernization program. We've seen the acceleration of the Army's strategic pacing. Even before the EDCA sites, the Army has already had already identified expanding the different bases around the archipelago because of the geopolitical changes and changes in our country. And the spokesperson for the EDCA right now was my former student, and he was like trying to say to the media that of course we have to engage also with the cyber domain, and it's the reason why that's the strength of the Army supposedly. And then of course you have the PA Flight Plan 2028, of course, where they're trying to modernize the Air Force, and of course with this comes with the modernization of the Army. Now, when you do external defense, of course, naturally you have the Air Force and the Navy there. Plus, of course, you have the modernization of the Coast Guard, which is, of course, outside that defense and security, because Coast Guard is a public safety organization. And then, of course, you have the VFA, Visiting Forces, was recalled in July 2021. That also helped with this EDCA, although it will lapse this year. But nonetheless, of course, the mere fact that we have allowed Washington to engage with us right now, that means that we might still extend that EDCA. And of course, the operationalization of the VFA will still continue, which comes from the mutual defense treaty that we have. Okay, now of course the talks there. Now that you have submarines all around in the region, well, the Philippines have it also. Myanmar has it, and what about the Philippines? So we're trying to recap with all these material needs that we have, basically in order for us to achieve that credible defense posture in the armed forces. Okay, now you have geopolitical thinking, given that, of course, we're saying that this is like a 2.0 Cold War, but of course, it may be different, it may not. What do we see? Real competition between the United States and China. We've seen that how China invested so much in their real capability, in their armed forces, in the People's Liberation Army Navy. Is it going to be relational? We've seen how China reactivated its economic clout lately with Russia, and how they are trying to transform multipolarity to bipolarity again, of course, with competition of the US and China, and the BRICS expansion. And we've seen that over the last few weeks. And is it going to be ideological? We'll see how this competition works. Because of course, even if China is a socialist country, it's still it's practicing capitalism basically in its economy. So we've seen a lot of changes basically in the past few weeks. Now, we have flashpoints basically. You have electronic warfare. We've seen that in the West Philippine Sea, and the aggression of the People's Liberation Army Navy with their Coast Guard, and which is military informed, and of course their militia. And so, and of course, there's a lot of debates about that, on how are we going to deal with these nine dash line, and what is now the status of China, and how would China treat the arbitration, and its entry to the Philippines exclusive economic zone. Some were saying that we have already arrived to a political warfare in which United States is not good at it right now when it comes to this economic warfare, because China is winning so far the hearts and minds of Filipinos. They have already influenced some of our local leaders. Some were saying that's the reason why it took hard for the national leaders to convince them to have their provinces become host of the EDCA sites, because naturally Chinese investors pull out. And of course, those are some of the contentions that we've heard so far in these narratives so far. And definitely, and then of course you have the initiatives coming from Japan, that is going to have a tripartite agreement with Washington and with Manila. And of course, we still do not know if this is feasible. But for me, I'd rather go for a bilateral over the tripartite agreement that we have with Washington or Tokyo, for that matter. So again, you have these now heightened competition in the region. Great powers, middle powers are trying to engage and trying to form their own alliances, fortifying their defense. and it brings a lot of insecurity among the region or countries around the region. So what would be my recommendation here, given that of course it's a political economic warfare that we're seeing right now. You have also cognitive warfare so far because of the different narratives, different truths that are available right now in over the net and in the news and in the academia. It's a dime, diplomatic, economic, informational, and military strategy. China is also trying to contest its economic prowess, and we've seen that this over this Asia and in the Indo-Pacific basically. And we wanted to see what would be the role of ASEAN when it comes to its dual strategy, when it comes to preserving its centrality in geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific region, and how it will augment its ability to endure its institutional hedging strategy. So I'll stop it there. Looking forward for your questions later on. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cabalsa. Thank you for your interesting statements, especially on the concept of national security, the indigenous national security concept. But for sure, other questions for you later. Okay, thank you, Dr. Cabalsa. Now let's proceed to Sir Laurel, please.
Yes, magandang hapon po sa lahat. I have a timer in front of me. I'll try to stick to the 5 minutes. As the guidelines of the organizers of this RTD advise, I deal first with the regional security situation, which I will describe with 4 words and a caveat, or 3 words and a caveat: peaceful, stable, and in economic recovery mode. But the caveat is expressed by Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim during his visit to Manila and to President PBBM in a TV interview. What did he say in the interview? I think that's the first image I show because this is actual interview. Is the PowerPoint in already, Anwar Ibrahim in the interview with I think I forget the exact, it's identified here, ANC, says US military presence in ASEAN should be avoided, and I think that is the sentiment of ASEAN as a whole. In fact, Indonesian ambassador to the Philippines, His Eminence Agus Widjojo, also said, in a military alliance, you have to have an agreement on the same threat. Do we have the same threat perception as the US about China? Well, 97% of the Filipino people says no, as evidenced by the 2022 December survey of Pulse Asia, showing that only 3% of the population is concerned with external threat, and number 15 out of 16 priority concerns of the Filipino people. We will explain why this is so, that the public impression is different from the actual perception of people. On the EDCA expansion and its risks and opportunities for the Philippines, there is only one simple answer too. The EDCA US military troops and bases are platforms for the US war in Asia, as slide number 2 will show. And this is a statement, February 1, of the American supervisor of all affairs in the South China Sea realm, Gregory Polling, who heads the Asia Maritime Institute, saying that access to sites in northern Luzon would help U.S. efforts to deter any Chinese move against Taiwan by putting the waters to the south of the island within range of shore-based missiles. They are the ones announcing they will install missiles in the Philippines and in the northern provinces. Now, this issue somebody raises about Taiwan and so on. I had 30 slides prepared, but I only settled for 6 because of the time limit. Avril Haines of the National Intelligence Agency of the United States testified in the U.S. Senate hearing just very recently that they detect no interest from China for a war on Taiwan because China is going to win Taiwan's unification by peaceful means, and that is oft repeated. Now, we will explain why the impression in many Filipino minds is different. We will explain later on. So Gregory Polling openly states this, and this immediately destabilizes this presence of the Americans, destabilize the region, targets China, and uses the Philippines as cannon fodder in propaganda, in the information war, etc., just like Ukraine and the other 45 wars of the US in the past 50 years. Slide 3 shows US bullying Filipino officials to accept the illegal and unconstitutional presence of the US troops here, US bases, facilities, and as Attorney Loja has already explained, unexaminable pre-positioned military equipment and supplies in the country waiting to devastate the Philippines. It is a sabotage of this action of the US and now Bongbong Marcos, whom I call Bobo Marcos, because this is inexcusable, this prevarication of this president. Because this is also a sabotage of mankind's history on the ascendance from the unipolar world to the higher plane of the multipolar world that all nations now seek to establish as a new human era. Slide 4 exposes the information war, and this is why there is so much misunderstanding of the facts on the ground and the intentions of China, the so-called attack of China on Taiwan, which is never a serious threat because China will win it, especially after the recent Kuomintang win in the midterm elections and the expected win in the next national elections. So slide 4 exposes the information war. This must be understood by our people, and so many of our media people are already ensnared in this, which is good for their livelihood. I don't mind that, but we must know the truth. And of course, I hate to mention this, but there are also jukebox scholars floating around, very noisy, but this is a reality we have to deal with. Of course, Attorney Loja is not one of them. I have very, very high respects for Attorney Loja. Okay, and we are asked to look at the way forward, while the way forward is shown by slide 5, that Vietnam and China achieved in joint operations in the Tonkin Gulf Agreement. And slide 4.1 shows what the US and envoys have mesmerized Filipinos in getting stuck with, the arbitration banana that can never be and may lead not only to an empty hand, but hands getting cut off. That is the trap the arbitration exercise put the country in combination with the information war. And we will never, like Vietnam, achieve anything positive for the country without negotiating with China. And that is what Teddy Boy Locsin, Del Rosario et al. Have been sabotaging, the productive discussions with China. I think I have one more or two paragraphs. The EDCA troops and bases is a final project of the US to resume its 500 years of, quote, forever wars, unquote, and stop the peaceful Asian century, envisioning, quote, forever peace, unquote, in the multipolar world era. The present gyrations of the Philippine government and cynical, nihilistic Filipino-American boys, civilized PMA, civilianized PMA generals, and some jukebox intellectuals and writers in their dance macabre put in peril this progressive march of history. Further forward is protest, educate, enlighten, and inform. How, quote, could the Philippines do to improve its security situation, unquote. This is from the organizers. But what is the threat? General Hermogenes Esperon has said time and again, China is not an enemy, unquote. And President Duterte recently said, quote, America is using us as a pawn to be staging areas in case of conflict between the US and China, unquote. So what is the threat? Let us define it. Let's be clear about it. America and the modern Macabebes and Principalia are the threats. These forces suppress Philippine economic development and political emancipation, serve Western imperialism and US hegemony to abort Asia's forever peace. Slide number 5 shows BBM attempting to sabotage the situation by saying that China need not worry about EDCA if there is no attack versus the Philippines. The problem, Mr. Bobo Marcos, is the US attack on China with a false flag operation that is a mark of US history, from the invasion of the Philippines by staging the false flag attack on the USS Maine, and a whole long list of such false flag attacks to trigger conflict and war. I think I will end at that because I think I've used up my 5 minutes. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Laurel, for sticking to the time in your very interesting presentation. Thank you, sir. And finally, let's proceed to Dr. Chan. Dr. Chan?
Oh, thank you very much. And I'm very lucky being the last speakers because Melissa, Dr. Siders, based in Singapore, and how everybody outside look at this. Now, number one, I must say it this way. People are not in Asia are not opposing EDCA. I don't think even China is opposing EDCA because Philippines has a history of being a very close ally of the United States. That's something everybody understands, everybody knows. What is really alarming is all of a sudden, there seems to be not only in expansion of the four bases, but a very heightened rhetorics that the Philippines now is going to take the position together with Japan and the US to somehow contain China. And every time you must understand, South China Sea is an important issue, not only to the Philippines and China. There are other three claimants, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei, to South China Sea. And if you remember, last 2 weeks ago, there was a very interesting development. The Vatican, the Pope, has officially repudiated the principle of discovery. And what does the principle of discovery means? And now, why I mentioned this is, even now the legal basis of this no historical claim in international maritime law is being questioned. And I think Malaysia, I'm sure that he will have her plate full in the next how many months or how many years about how international law is going to be reinterpreted and how those native people will file claim against their respective governments. Because even the church now said the so-called principle of discovery is morally incorrect. So historical claim now is going to go back to international arbitrations. Okay, now this is not only the point. The point is that in ASEAN, the predominant view is that we are not asking the US to leave, but we don't want their military presence here, okay? And we recognize that it's very important for China's economic interest for these regions, because whether we like it or not, we must remember Singapore has a per capita of 70 to 80,000 US dollars, but the whole of ASEAN, the average is only 5,000. So ASEAN needs development. So there's always an issue of priorities. In ASEAN, we still believe we want a stable international environment, but at the same time, we recognize economic development is very important to us, okay? So number two, also, again, I emphasize, ASEAN want US military presence. We are not driving them out, but we want economic co-prosperity with China. We don't want militarization of the regions. That is what Herman is talking about. The White Anwar talk about they don't want US military presence, okay? Now, number two is this. Let us look at the historical background. You talk about South China Sea. I think right now, I always maintain this thing is that when President Duterte was able to get a 60-40% share, that's actually not a very bad deal. Because I always say that if you are talking to the Vietnamese and the Malaysians, and which we are both ASEAN members, I really doubt whether they can offer 60-40 to the Philippines, okay? And number two is this. You must remember this South China Sea Islands is a disputed area. If you recall in 1898, Paris Treaty, that part is not there. Of course, I was always asked about this, and I said, I do not know as an economist, but I always say that for this kind of unsettled issues, if you look at history, which I always refer to, I said, most territorial dispute is not settled by courts, it's settled by mutual agreements. Because when you talk about territory, there's always a nationalistic, emotional issues. You explain these issues to the layman in the street, whether it's the Chinese, the Malaysians, the Vietnamese, or the Filipinos, they don't understand. So it has to be an agreement that is accepted by the peoples. If you want to go to the court, then at the end, it's just going to be a mess. Now, I will put it this way. There are several assumptions I believe that the policymakers make when they decided on EDCA expansions. The first is that this is very common. People always say that you have to stay at the right side of history. Now, in layman's term, what is the meaning of the right side of history? You stay with the winner. That is what Melissa said. Have we looked into all scenarios that who is going to prevail if ever the unlikely event of a war breaks out? Now, I will put it this way. I myself really subscribe to with that there's no nuclear war, not even Mearsheimer's name the nuclear war. Because once the nuclear war started, I don't know where can you stop it. Okay, you begin with a tactical nuclear war, and you then escalate to a short-range nuclear war, and then you escalate it to a medium-range nuclear war. At the end, you have an ICBM shooting each others. Because once you have a mass casualties on either side, there's going to no end to the story. You must remember when Putin said, what is the use of the world when there's no Russia? And today, I think President Biden still follow that rules. No matter what he did in Ukraine, no American soldiers officially is in Ukraine. Now, so if you look at this thing, I think that is something why I want to bring in my little knowledge about industrial revolutions to you. If you look at each industrial revolutions, what they represent is not just economics or technologies. What they represent is military powers. And there's always a time that the military powers shift. Now, unfortunately, to the surprise of everybody, even the American generals, because I follow the American website quite closely, America now is facing a scenario. First, if you remember the Cold War, it's a military confrontations. If you look at 1980s, the economic warfare with Japan is an economic warfare. Now today, this is the first time in US history that they are facing peer competitors, not only in technology, but military, economics, and everything. Now, if you look at the Ukraine war, there's one advice I am not so sure whether the decision maker has followed. The warfare has changed. Before you talk about Army, Navy, Air Force, as Chester mentioned, but now if you look at the Ukraine war, you know how important is the cyber warfare. And more than cyber warfare, you know how the Starlink involved in the war. So instead of free command of the armed forces, now you have the cyberspace command, and you have the outer space command, the Space Force of the United States. Now, what is the point is this? In this kind of warfare, it might not be very wise for any second world or third world countries to get involved in. That is why when everybody heard Macron last Saturday on his plane back to Paris, he gave a very interesting statement, which is, Taiwan is not our war. Europe should not get involved in. Now, you must remember in Europe, if you take aside US role in NATO, the strongest military power is France. And if the French president can give that kind of statement, I really feel that the policymaker must be very careful to make sure that we don't get involved in the US-China war. Because any military generals, remember, they are the most conservative animals in the world. In the code of conduct for military men, you are not supposed to fire until order, but you are given the power to shoot back if there's a perceived danger. So the most critical thing is that EDCA is already a fait accompli. But how to prevent the Philippines from getting involved in a Taiwan war, as the president has said, and as Melissa, Chester, and Herman has said, is something that you have to now look into the details of implementing the EDCA. My personal view is that nobody opposed EDCA because everybody knows how close is the Filipinos to the Americans. In fact, the Filipinos has a higher trust ratings to American government than American themselves. Okay, so, but we have to remember that the consequence of Philippines to get into a war is very grievous. If even French, as the nuclear power, a United Nations P5, will get that kind of an open statement, what is our business in Taiwan, then you will know that their consequence. And number two is that there's always an assumption that first we believe China will not attack Taiwan. Number two, they always believe that if China attacks Taiwan, Americans will come. And the third belief they have is if Americans come, American will prevail. Okay, that was their belief before the Nancy Pelosi visit last August. Anybody following military strategies realize that how serious is the Chinese exercise of Taiwan. I say in Singapore Airlines canceled the flights to Taipei and all the ships get away from the exercise areas. And the US aircraft carrier, unlike 1996, they pass through Taiwan. They get away from Taiwan. So the military situation now has probably changed. Not to everybody's like or dislike, but if you look at how now Europe and China is approaching, how now Xi Jinping is going to be the peacemaker in Europe, probably you have to realize that the whole paradigm of our understanding of the world since 1521, when Magellan came to the Philippines, probably has changed. We are facing an era that is different from the last 600 years. The balance of power has changed, and the change does not come just because of China. It's because of industrial revolutions. If you remember great power politics, the British started the industrial revolutions and they overtook France as the European powers. Everybody should remember, at the beginning of 19th century, French population was 3 times the British. But because of industrial revolutions, they have better weapons, they beat Napoleons, they have more money to shell out to build up alliance in Europe, so the British prevail. Now, in the second industrial revolutions, you see how fast the German and the American rise and just demolish this Pax Britannica. Now, in the third industrial revolution of 1980s, when the Japanese economic challenge to America was so great, we have books like Barbarian at the Gate coming up in the United States. The US, because of digital electronics and computer science, they beat the Japanese back. Now we are at the threshold of 4th industrial revolutions. You never imagine a war that is fought by the drones, that is fought by space starlinks, that is fought by precision ammunitions. Now, do you think that any developing countries in the world today has any chance of facing a superpowers? Just 2 left today is very clear, China and the United States. It is going to be wishful thinking for you to think about how to fight these 2 giants. Now, if they fight among themselves, what will be your stand? And I think that is what the national interest dictate. The last thing I want to put it is that whether we like it or not, our national priority now is development. No leaders want to sacrifice an inch of national territories, but there's always an issue of priorities. If you believe our priority is still development, let us look for ways that we can stay away from those major power conflicts in which the technology today already dictated that you should not get involved. So later during our discussion, I think I have more questions than answers I can give, because I'm sure EDCA has been a topic that has been thoroughly discussed. But the problem is that have the decision makers consider all the elements involved? And if they have not considered all the elements, if they are going to do the next thing, how are they going to prevent the countries from sliding into an unwanted war, as President Macron has said 2 days ago? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Chan. Very interesting point, sir. Okay, so at this juncture, I shall be asking our panelists questions on 3 important matters relative to EDCA. I know that our resource persons have answered the questions, but for the sake of more clarity and more details for our attendees, I'll still ask these questions. Okay, first, I'd like to propound questions on regional security. How would you characterize the current security of the region, taking into consideration the widely publicized memorandum leak from the US military that an imminent US and China military confrontation could occur as early as 2025? Also, what are the abiding geopolitical interests of the major actors in the region, specifically China, US, and Japan, and the most recent policies and actions relating to regional power balance? And finally, in what ways do you think the recent domestic political developments influence the respective power projection in the region? Okay, let me start with Dr. Loha.
Thank you for the question. The current regional security situation can be characterized very briefly as one where there is a security dilemma. And we know that in the internal dynamics of a security dilemma could lead to an actual conflict. And we know this in the form of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Ukraine war. In this particular security dilemma, we have the Philippines invoking deterrence as the reason for the prepositioning of American weapons. Of course, on the part of China, it does not recognize the action of the Philippines as one of deterrence, but rather for China, it is an encirclement and therefore a security threat. On the part of the US, their position is ambivalent. First, they would say that this is all about the protection of the Philippines and therefore this is a deterrent action. Yet in its RAND policy papers and other congressional policy papers, it is very explicit in its reasoning that the EDCA prepositioning of weapons is purposely to encircle China and to enable the US to intervene in Taiwan in case of a forcible exercise of sovereignty by China in Taiwan. I shall leave the other questions to the other panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Loha. Dr. Cabalsa, what's your take on this?
If I will summarize it, it is a time bomb ready to explode. So that's how I see it basically. But this is a competition. And in any competition, you will hear world wars. Right now, we are hearing world wars right now. And definitely, there will be cognitive warfare. Because, of course, you have different truths. This is a post-truth era now. Truth has become subjective. We also blame the Americans for doing that because during the war on terror, they started that kind of truth. When in fact, now everybody can have their own truth. I know for sure that China and the US doesn't want war, even the Philippines, because that's too expensive for us. We're seeing this is going to be different from what we saw in the Russia-Ukraine war. If there will be war in our region, in our backyard, this is the most expensive war so far that we will be seeing because the number 1 and number 2 world economies are fighting in our backyard. So we cannot afford that. That's the reason why we need peaceful mechanisms to address these issues. World war is good, but not world war.
Truly world war. Okay, thank you, Dr. Cabalsa. Sir Laurel?
Yes,
what's your take on this?
let me just, am I muted? No, I'm okay. Can you hear
We
me?
can hear you loud and clear,
Okay.
sir.
As I said at the very start, the situation in our region is peaceful, stable, and in economic recovery mode. And this has been the situation in spite of U.S. efforts since 2011, named Pivot to Asia, threatening to move 60% of its military forces to Asia to counter the peaceful rise of China. If you read retired General Victor Corpus's book, you will find that in 2008, as far back as that, he already said the US will want war by 2025 with China in order to destroy and bring down Chinese GDP by at least 35%, so that the US can restore its economic and industrial vitality. This is what is happening in Europe now. They threatened Russia with NATO encroachment into Ukraine, which Russia had to respond to. But the target was not just Russia, it was also Germany, to keep Germany down. As they've always said, NATO is intended to keep Germany down, Russia out, and the United States in. And the United States is deindustrializing Germany and providing incentives to the tune, I think, of hundreds of billions of dollars incentives to German companies to move to the United States. So General Minihan, Air Force General, who has, some say irrelevant to the Taiwan issue, suddenly announced this January that there will be war with China by 2025, exactly as General Corpus also said. So this is a strategic plan of the United States of America to try to restore its economic and industrial vitality, to try to wipe out its financial debt to the world, running into hundreds of trillions, actually, including its own domestic debt. So this is an upsetting of the apple cart so that they can rearrange things. Whether it is not the goal of the United States to win a war against against China. They cannot win it in this region. And Rand Corporation has run several exercises, and they have never won. The Americans have never won. But the goal is simply limited destruction of the Chinese economy. Now, will there be a nuclear war? Well, you can watch Ukraine and study it. They go to the verge but never push over the edge, because that is the intention: economic destruction, so that America can restore its economic vitality. Now, this is maybe where I will take a bit more time, although my eyesight is already. Just give me one more second to get focused. So somebody said this is the post-truth period. That is absolutely false. Truth is still facts and historical facts. You verify truth by going back to history, as the history of the United States and the West has shown us 500 years of forever wars. And they still build their economies, the United States at least today, on war. And we must learn that, and we must tell our people that, because we are being fed to the next war that the Americans are trying to design for our region. Well, there are other issues, but I will not take too much time. Back to you.
Very bold statement, sir. Thank you very much. Sir Chan, Dr. Chan, what's your take on this?
You mentioned a very interesting date. Somebody predict a war breaking out in 2025. Somebody predict 2027. Now, that is my answer to that question. Actually, the Chinese, Sun Tzu, I think everybody knows that's the oldest book on Art of War. And in the Mao Zedong thought, they have some principles when they launch a war. The first is that they never go to a war that they cannot win. Okay. Second is that they never go to a war unprepared. Third, they never go to a war out of anger. So if you look at what happened during the Nancy Pelosi visit, it's a de facto blockade of Taiwan Island. Okay, the whole island was encircled. If you look at the just concluded 3-day exercise, it's another de facto encirclement. China yesterday launched 91 jet sorties and 11 warships in a military exercise. The size of this exercise is one of the largest in East Asian history since the end of Vietnam War. So if you look at the deployment of force, the Taiwan military has run a lot of simulations in the last 10 years, all behind the doors and secret. And the conclusion is that they always lose every war because China has land-based asset and sea-based asset. The US only can rely on sea-based asset. And you must remember, as a military strategist, the land-based asset is always half to 1 generations ahead of the sea-based assets. So before the Nancy Pelosi visit, 60 to 70% of Taiwanese believe in the 3 things that I mentioned earlier. China will not come. Number 2, if China come, American will come. The last, if American come, American can prevail. That was what you think. If you look at what happens in today's Ukraine-Russian war, Russia make the stupid mistake. They think that firepower is everything, but they forget it is now precision firepowers. So just a one-word difference, the whole paradigm of warfare has changed. And I think all the American generals you talk to, they know what is happening today on the ground. So will China attack 2023, 2025, or 2027? I don't think even Xi Jinping or Biden knows. But if ever they attack, they will make sure that they follow principle number 1, 2, 3. They are prepared. They are not doing it out of emotions, and they make sure that they can win. This is one thing very, very important. This is not a joke of the day. Okay, this is something very serious. If ever we have a misstep, the consequences is very there. And number 2, that's one thing is on question number 1. China will not attack. They forget for a country with 5,000-year history, If you look at the human mankind history, tell me, which rising power will allow its country to be divided? I don't see any. In the North-South War of the America, you know that the South wanted to invite the UK, the British at that time to came in. And you know what happened? The Americans did, right? They were never blockade against the number one imperial power at that time, the British Empire. And the British get away from the Civil War. So this is one thing, is there's a lot of misjudgment. Our fear of losing, China will never attack Taiwan, yes and no. Today, if you look at the military build-up and you study all the military science and weaponry, you will realize that the Chinese attack is not something impossible. I must say that the Chinese are very historically inclined peoples. They will not start a civil war. But if they are being forced to start a civil war, I think that the Chinese will fight. If you remember the Korean War at that time, China at that time was so poor, but yet they still go to Korea to fight. So this is some judgment issues that the leader has to consider. And this is one thing is about the message. I think the president is really very sincere to say that if nobody attack us, we will not use it as a base. But if you look at the Balikatan, today in the international press, the news is that 12,200 US soldiers and 5,400 Filipino soldiers and 111 Australians will participate. Now, if you look at the numbers, there are double the number of American soldiers in Balikatan than the Filipino soldiers. So you said an American exercise or a Filipino exercise. That is a question mark. And number two, if this is the largest exercise in the last ever since. If you look at the American warships, they will bring the fighters, the Patriot missiles, the HIMARS, and then the Javelin. They might look very impressive. But if you look at the military today, China has better Javelin. China has better HIMARS and better missiles than Patriots. Now, even the US now recognize the F-22 might just be a peer fighter with China's J-20. So these are Viper, F-16 Vipers that Taiwanese is bought a lot, is probably not going to work very far. So again, what I'm trying to say is that probably we should give more information to the leaders for them to really get the most realistic pictures of the risk and reward, as what Dean Sevilla has said. What is good for the Philippines? The Filipino must decide. And to decide, I'm sure nothing is an up-to-date information. And this information is not just about dollar and cents. This information now is a very cold fact that I'm sure that Dr. Cablasa knows. It is now at the end, it is might is right. So that's how I react to your question.
Okay, thank you, sir. Many quotable quotes today. Okay, speaking of Philippine security, I have two questions on the matter. How prudent or imprudent do you think is the recent expansion of EDCA sites from the point of view of Philippine security? Also, what are the risks and opportunities for the Philippines? And finally, what is your assessment of EDCA? Do you think the agreement should be continued, modified, or abrogated? Sir Laurel?
Well, I will quote the title of one of your scholars in the University of the Philippines, Roland Simbulan. These are the basis of our insecurity, not security. They bring to us destabilization. They bring to us insecurity. Already, Governor Ebdani of Zambales is calling for, what do they call that status? Red alert status, because of the security situation or concerns in the province of Zambales, if I'm not mistaken. So it has already introduced insecurity. And prior to the Obama pivot to Asia, the reversals of the American trade war, which America really lost, and so on and so forth, China has been passive and defensive throughout. The Americans accuse China of wolf warrior diplomacy when it's the Americans who coined the term just to tag China and paint it as a ferocious beast, which is absolutely untrue. Now, so Now this brings us to the Taiwan question, and 50% of Taiwanese exports go to China, 40% to China mainland, 10% to Hong Kong. There are 2 million Taiwanese citizens who live inside China, working and doing business in China. China does not need to physically take over Taiwan, except that there is a core group of American creations inside China, the DPP, Democratic People's Party, if I recall it correctly, Tsai Ing-wen, and so on, like in the Philippines. And they do this in Germany, like Annalisa Baerbock, the ultra anti-Russian German politician, and so on and so forth. Because of their dominance over the past 50 years, they have been able to cultivate domestic assets. But China has up to 2049 to wait. And they are already today at 2023 achieving the political preparation for peaceful reintegration, reunification. It is there. The former president of Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou, just visited mainland China and feted in mainland China. What is the message of that? He's a Kuomintang president before. That China and Taiwan will get together maybe after this next election when Kuomintang wins. Maybe. But the point is, there is no tension, there is no trouble in our region if the Americans are not here. Now, we're not saying, and China is not saying that America is not welcome here, but warships, don't we all remember gunboat diplomacy of the 19th century that forced open Japan, forced open everybody, and subjected us to 2 centuries or 3 centuries of Western colonialism? Now, what I want to stress, I don't know if I'm going out of topic, but still the positive vision. We are in a position, the Philippines in particular, if we stop the Americans here, we are going to be the pivotal factor in creating that 500 years of forever peace. And the redivert or rechannel trillions of war financial investments into peaceful development and achieve the dream of peace on earth and goodwill to all men and erase poverty in the world. That is the exciting potential if we stop the American war machine today here in the Philippines. Sorry if I got out of topic. There's a question, by the way, here from somebody from PUP, but if you can take a look at it, it's a very long question, but maybe you can raise it, our moderator.
Yes, sir. After our
Yes.
discussion, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank
Very
you.
interesting points. Okay, Dr. Loha, a while ago you provided us your assessment of the EDCA. Do you think really that we can abrogate, continue, or modify this treaty? Dr. Loha?
Okay, good. One important thing that we need to bear in mind is that the EDCA is not a suicide pact. We do not need to die in the name of EDCA, or perhaps in the name of America. Now, there is a need for every Filipino to be aware of the disadvantageous terms of the EDCA as it was negotiated and agreed upon in 2014, especially in the light of the collapse of the nuclear disarmament legal infrastructure. And here I share a comparative table that I made, which would show to you why our EDCA is very much disadvantageous. If you look at the EDCA of Bulgaria, it says here that the host government of Bulgaria has the right and authority to be notified as to the type of weapons that the United States will preposition. It is even more stringent when it comes to the EDCA of Australia. Are you able to see the screen? Are
Yes.
you able to see? Okay. Now, the EDCA of Australia provides that if the United States will preposition weapons, the Australian government would have to exercise its right to object. It should be given enough time to object before the United States will ship the weapons in Australian territory. Moreover, there is a continuing provision that the US prepositioning of weapons should always be in accordance with Australian law. Therefore, for instance, if the EDCA of Australia was in effect in 2015, and in 2023, Australia will adopt a law which says that they will not accept weapons with a range of 500 kilometers. And if there is a weapon of that kind that the US will want to position in Australia, then this provision on the prohibition on weapons being in violation of an Australian law would kick in. Now, in our EDCA, there is no such provision. If you look at the Philippine EDCA, it is right here. We are only notified as to the quantities and delivery schedules. There is no mention as to the type of weapon. Now, if you look at the provision on the prohibition on the prepositioning of nuclear weapons, it is very clear there. However, how are we to know whether the weapons that the US will be prepositioning would have a nuclear capability or not, unless we are able to inspect the weapons prior to shipment? And this is where we can preempt a possible naval quarantine or naval blockade by China in reaction to the first shipment of prepositioned weapons of the US. By insisting or negotiating a temporary or provisional arrangement with the US that the Philippines would be able to inspect the weapons before they are prepositioned. This is the particular provision that is the basis for saying that even if the EDCA site is in Tawi-Tawi, we are still in trouble because we have no control over the type of weapons that will be prepositioned. And of course, if you look at the Singapore provision, the EDCA of Singapore itself is confidential. I have not been able to look at the text, but it is governed by a strategic framework agreement which provides that the Singapore will provide the facilities for weapons. However, there is no prohibition there on Singapore making decisions as to when and how these weapons will be used by the US. In the Philippines, compared to Bulgaria and Australia, the Philippines also will have no right to prevent the US from using these prepositioned weapons to engage in an offensive war or maybe a preemptive strike. Even if the president of the Philippines says that the EDCA will not be used for any preemptive strike or offensive strike, the president has no power because under EDCA, it is the United States alone which can make that decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Loha. Very interesting comparisons, really to ponder upon. Thank you. Dr. Cabalsa, what's your take on this?
Simple lang naman yung gusto natin eh. We want just simple wish for the Philippines, no? The Americans will not be here if they did not take our mischief reef, our Scarborough Shoal, if they are not encroaching in the West Philippine Sea. Yun lang naman eh. Umalis sila. Tatahimik kami.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cabalsa. Very bold statement indeed. So in the interest of time, I'll just ask this last questions. It seems to me that some of the concerns really are valid and well-founded. So at any rate, we should also try to find out how the situation can be met in ways that will really work to the advantages of the Philippines and by extension of our neighbors in the region. So this brings me to my last two questions. In what ways do you think could the Philippines improve its security situation, military and otherwise, given the increasing great power conflict in the region? And what could be the role of traditional multilateral organizations like ASEAN and bilateral diplomacy? Anyone?
Well,
Let's start
I'll start it
sir.
off by saying that we have to build up our economy because there's no point in talking about defense if your economy cannot sustain it. This is what China has shown. This is what America has shown. It's weakening posture, defense posture, because its economy cannot sustain. They cannot even supply the ammunition needed by Ukraine now. They are 13 years behind their production schedules for their ammunition and other war equipment. So they are not going to win in Ukraine. This is the same case here in Asia. But anyway, the other question, so what else should we do? Well, we continue with the mediation. We complete the oil and gas deal so that we can have hundreds of billions of dollars revenue to build up our economy if it is not absorbed, sucked out by the oligarchs again, like Manny Pangilinan and so on.
Hey, Sean, can I call you back after 15 minutes?
Hello. Am I
Yes,
muted?
sir.
Yeah.
Go on, sir.
Okay, you can hear me now. Okay, and about the issue on the South China Sea claims, let us be clear. There are several countries with different claims. There are histories to this, much longer. In fact, the latest claimant is the Philippines, and only in the 1970s. While you can trace the history of the claims of Vietnam, China, and so on to the 40s, to the Potsdam Declaration, and so on and so forth. So you want me to be frank about our claim? We have the weakest claim, based all on propaganda. Now, about Scarborough, kinuha daw Scarborough, the importance of the Scarborough to the Chinese defense of its soft underbelly, which is the South China Sea, that has been used as the successful invasions of China for the past hundreds of years, 400 invasions from the sea. You go back to General Victor Corpus, who says that China has to control and guard the Scarborough Shoal because it is the exit of Subic Bay and the point where I forget the class of submarines that the Americans use to stealthily enter Subic and exit Subic and through the Manila Trench, which is a critical point because it takes only 5 to 10 minutes for missiles from these, I forget again the name of the submarines, the class of submarines, to reach southern China's industrial belt. You have to go back much deeper than just all this propaganda. And there are questions about, what about the harassment of the fishermen? Tell me if any of this harassment has been proven. Because if they prove it, they will get millions for the fishermen. The Philippine Coast Guard just last month admitted they have never had a full disclosure of all these cases of harassment. Why don't they have things to disclose? Because most of them are spurious and not serious. Just propaganda every day. That's why I gave stress to the information war. But I've taken a lot of time, so back to you.
Interesting comments, sir. Okay, how about you, Sir Chan? What's your take on this?
Mr. Chan is muted. Mr. Chan is muted.
Hello, sir.
Mute, unmute. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
no.
sir.
Okay. Now,
I can.
caution the Philippines about this territorial claim. In fact, if you look at the territorial claim, the strongest Philippine claim is on Sabah. We have documents. But in 1960s, when President Macapagal tried to invoke the Mutual Defense Agreement on Sabah, and he got a very flung answers from the Americans. Now, what I'm trying to say is this. South China Sea is a disputed area. But I'm not saying that the Philippine claim is wrong. What I'm just trying to say is that if you look at the Vietnamese, if you look at the Malaysians, I think if you go close to their islands, they will do the same thing. So I hope that the country keep a very, very open-minded on South China Sea. Or else, this is going to be another Pandora's box. Not it's going to leap out on our face. And as I always said, if you look at the development history, that's one thing you'll be very surprised. The best economic development in the last 30 years in Southeast Asia was Vietnam. And if you look at the Vietnam, they can confront China militarily, but at the same time, they know how to deal with China. One thing for sure, they never touch the Taiwan issues. Now, if we say that because of South China Sea, we are trying to touch Taiwan issues, that is going to be the biggest dangers the country ever faced. Because as I said, in history of 5,000 years, there was never a rising power that is going to allow anyone, not even the United States, to touch their territorial claim. And if we are insisting on that, there's only one outcome, war. And the next question you have to ask is that, are you prepared for it? Because Chinese philosophy has these three things. They will never go to a war they cannot win. They will never go to a war unprepared. And they will never go to a war that out of emotions. And Chester, you have to be very careful about this. Because word war is what these small countries can do. No problem. We can always talk. Okay? But if you go to real war, these people might not be very kind. So this is what I want to say is that every country has priorities. You cannot have your plate full. Look at your resources you have. You have to choose between your priorities, make the smart move. Any international alliance, provided they can bring what you want, go into it. International relation is always very cruel animals. At the end, only outcome counts, period. So that's all I can say based on history, based on international relations. Thank you.
Very useful advice, sir. Okay, now let's go to Dr. Cabalsa. What's your take on this?
Yeah. Just a simple reflections here. There are different great ideas that were raised, pro, anti, and we're trying to synthesize everything. We're trying to be reasonable, logical here. But what does China want from the Philippines? Does China want that we renounce the arbitration case that we won? Does China want that we don't want to develop our military? Does China want that we will just follow them? Does China want that we will get rid of the Americans in this region? What does China want? We don't know what China wants from the Philippines. So it's more of a question rather than answer for me.
Thank you, Chester. It's $1 million question, I think. Okay, so thank you very much to our guest for your compelling insights. We shall now listen to, yes?
Michelle, can I give a last name? I forget. Is that
yes,
number
sir.
One thing is this. Actually, if you look at Philippine history, I think it's very important that American presence is here. It's a psychological support to the Philippines. Okay? I think the issue now is not about EDCA. Is that if you have 3 bases that is facing Taiwan and only 1 basis facing South China Sea, outsiders might interpret it very differently about this EDCA. So my stand is there is no need to abolish EDCA. But Brett, the best way is we follow what Melissa has said. Okay? Let us look at the provisions so Philippines will not get into an unwanted conflict. In fact, right now, there's already Pandora's box opening on this American potential withdrawal from Asia. The Japan inside the country is talking about nuclear weapons. And the South Korean is going to talk about nuclear weapons. The current situation in East Asia is very, very unstable. Now, Chester, we all know who can stop the South Korean if not the Americans? Who can stop the Japanese if not the Americans? So I will tell you, maybe China inside them, they might not want Philippines to abolish EDCA. Oh, I'm sorry if that is the way I think of from a very realist point of geopolitics, which I think that the Philippine intellects has to really think deeper about the potential consequence in any actions. We are not dealing with foreign policies on a yearly basis, on a monthly basis, or even on a decade basis. We have to look at what is the best for the Philippines 10, 20, 30 years from today. Okay, thank you.
I think we need a second round of discussion with this animated discussions that we have here. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Loha, I didn't ask you these questions. We would love really to hear your comments or your insights on the last two questions I mentioned a while ago. Like, in what ways do you think could the Philippines improve its security situation? And what could be the possible role of traditional multilateral organizations like ASEAN and bilateral diplomacy as well? Dr. Loha?
Thank you. First, we have to focus on the COC, and we have to revive the vitality of ASEAN as a security arrangement. Now, before, ASEAN was a security arrangement against communism. This time, it can still be a security arrangement against a possible conflict, armed conflict in Southeast Asia. Third, the COC can be functional. I know that there is difficulty in concluding a COC at present. By functional, I mean a COC along the lines of maritime law enforcement, Coast Guard to Coast Guard, not necessarily China, Philippine Coast Guard, but Philippine, China, Malaysian, Indonesian, Vietnamese Coast Guard. At least there should be a functional COC so that we can minimize conflict. There can also be a functional COC in terms of fisheries, and this can be undertaken by our fisheries associations. We look at history and we know that Japan and China and Taiwan had a fisheries association arrangement in the East China Sea prior to the conclusion of any fisheries agreement by the states. And the fisheries arrangement, which started in 1955, was initiated by the private fisheries association. In terms of the Coast Guard, China and Vietnam have been undertaking joint patrol using their own coast guards together. In our case, we ought to revive the memorandum of understanding or agreement, Coast Guard to Coast Guard, between China, Philippines, and Vietnam, which was scuttled by Locsin for some reason regarding turf war. But these are options that we can already undertake to minimize the risk of a conflict in the South China Sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Loha. No, we really appreciate your insights into this. We have interesting questions here from our attendees. Okay, just give me a minute. We are trying to filter, quote unquote, these questions in the interest of time. Okay.
Sorry, Miss Michelle.
Yes?
I apologize. I won't have time to stay on after 4. If I may, can I do my reaction now?
Yes, Professor Ibarra. Okay, no worries, sir. Okay, so we shall now listen to the synthesis and response to be provided by Assistant Professor Edsel John Ibarra of the UP Political Science Department, and after which we will entertain Q&A questions from our attendees. Sir Ibarra, the screen is yours.
Thank you. First, I apologize for this, for not being able to stay after 4. I'll try, but I have another engagement, so I just like to put this out in the open now. No? And this is a tall task I'm being given now. No? As I'm sure all of us have seen, no, this issue has raised so many viewpoints, no? And many of those viewpoints are not really very easily cannot be easily reconciled, correct? No? The first thing, we have a very different visions of the future. No, we have people who believe that great power politics will eventually lead into conflict. We have people who believe that great power politics will eventually lead into a negative peace type of situation because of a balance of power between United States and China. There are some who believe that the future is peaceful, no, and will be marked by more cooperation, more economic integration. And I know Dr. Henry Chan has said a lot of things, no, but I deduced from one of what he's saying that visions of the future does not really relate to great power politics. No, it's the economy, stupid, no, and it's the process of international political economy that matters more than great power politics. No, how the for how the industrial revolution that we're experiencing now will lead into. And perhaps we just don't know. No, it's tough trying to predict the future. No, even us political scientists don't engage in the business of predicting the future. It's a tough task. No, but it is true. No, and in as we've seen in Dr. Loca's presentation, that we have to even if the future is uncertain, we have to make plans to prepare for whatever futures there will be, whether it will be a peaceful future, whether it will be a future marked by conflict. No? And these different visions of the future has affected how each of us views how we should go about with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Some of us are thinking that we can still salvage the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement and just amend the problematic parts of it. Others are convinced that EDCA as it is can stay, and let's keep it as it is at the moment. And there are some of us who believe that EDCA should be thrown out right away. And again, Dr. Henry Chan proposed a different viewpoint from all of this. Now, I know he agreed with Dr. Loca in amending the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, but in his opening statement, he implied that perhaps this debate about the future of EDCA is irrelevant, insofar as the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement is concerned with conventional weaponry. We're now at the time in military history and military technology where conventional weaponry will not be the decisive factor in fighting out wars. And so perhaps we are ascribing more importance to EDCA than it actually has. If we connect these two things, so that we are uncertain about what the future holds, and that perhaps EDCA, we're painting EDCA to be more consequential than it really is. Mind you, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement is still in its infancy. Yes, it was signed in 2014, but until 2016, we waited for the Supreme Court to decide on its legal status before trying to implement it. And then President Duterte shifted to not really emphasizing the implementation of EDCA. So one could argue that it's only now that we're starting to implement the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement after 9 years. So EDCA is still in its infancy, and what we have now, the recent news that there are 4 additional EDCA sites, those are additional EDCA sites. There are already 5 original EDCA sites, and if we look at what's already in those 5 EDCA sites, most of them are humanitarian assistance and disaster relief assets. So perhaps we might be putting too much consequence to what the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement has in store. Maybe it's really just a humanitarian assistance and disaster relief agreement. But of course, we're not very naive to believe that it's just for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. But if we look at the status of EDCA now, and what's really happening in those existing sites, that's what we would be. That's what I would conclude. That's what I would conclude is happening in the on the ground. But with all these discussions about EDCA, I really found it intriguing that we discussed more about United States history. We discussed more about the United States, the U.S. diplomacy. We discussed more about Chinese history and what China has done diplomatically and militarily. It seems that we're forgetting the Philippines in all of these narratives. We haven't much talked about Philippine interests yet here. We've framed this debate so far as being, is it in the US, in the United States interest? Is this in the interest of China? For for whatever we hold the vision of the future to be, I must highlight what I think it was Dr. Cabalsa who mentioned it. If we look at the diplomatic history of the negotiation of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, it was clearly a reaction to what the administration at that time, the administration of Aquino III, perceived to be an increasingly assertive posturing by China in the South China Sea. So if we look at the timeline, 2012, the Scarborough Shoal standoff happened. 2013, we filed the case in the international, in the UNCLOS Arbitration Tribunal. 2014, we finalized the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. So for me, the connection between the signing of the EDCA and the South China Sea disputes is very clear. It just so happened that during the Duterte administration, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement was shifted to its humanitarian assistance and disaster relief aspect, rather than on its maritime security, maritime domain awareness aspect. And it's only now that we're returning to what I argue would be the original intent of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which leads us to, as a side note, it's a very weird it's a very weird thing that the Marcos administration is continuing not Duterte's foreign policy, but Aquino's foreign policy in connection to EDCA. So for the Philippines, the EDCA was a solution for what it perceived to be a real threat by China in the South China Sea. And that threat, I would emphasize, is not territorial, it's maritime. So I know that Mr. Laurel earlier said that our territorial claims in the South China Sea are very weak. I would personally, I would also think that way, but we have to separate it from the maritime aspect of the disputes. There's a maritime aspect to it, and if our territorial case in the South China Sea is very weak, I think our maritime case in the South China Sea is very strong. Otherwise, we wouldn't have won in the UNCLOS tribunal after all. So the fact that we won makes it very clear that our maritime claims are very much aligned with international law. And so I just want to highlight that into the discussion. What are the Philippines' interests here? First one, it's trying to secure itself from what it's perceiving to be a increasingly assertive China. And on this case, I really am quite flabbergasted by China's strategic miscalculation when President Duterte initiated the abrogation of the Visiting Forces Agreement. China would have had an opportunity then to have the VFA canceled for real. For the steps were set in motion already during that time. But what China did was that instead, rather than exercise restraint, it was during this time that we've seen a lot more news about Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea. So I think this also prompted and kind of explains why Duterte turned out to be more harder line against China at the end of his term compared to what his situation was during the start of the term. So I just want to inject in the discussion here, what were the Philippine interests at that time, and to try to highlight it in our discussions. We have our own agency here. We have to remember that EDCA, for all its faults, was negotiated in good faith by our very brilliant diplomats, diplomats of the highest caliber, and they had the Philippine interests in mind. We might disagree on what those interests are, but during that time, this is clearly what they were seeing to be the interests of the Philippines. So perhaps I would also sympathize with Dr. Cabalsa, and to conclude this, to conclude all of this, if the EDCA was a response to the South China Sea, what was happening in the South China Sea, No, why not eliminate that threat in the first place? No, and we won't have this issue about disagreements on the usefulness of EDCA to begin with. No, so I think no, this has been a very difficult task for me trying to reconcile so many different and divergent viewpoints. No, but I hope no we are still able to remember Philippine interests at this in this discussion. So thank you very much, and I apologize again if I have to leave earlier. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ibarra, for clarifying some points and for your reaction on this topic. Okay, speaking of national interest, we have a question related to that for Sir Laurel. This is a question, sir, from, well, it's in the chat box, but I'll read it for our attendees. We have a question here for you from an IR student from PUP. Looking at recent history, Xi Jinping told us in 2015 that the occupation of Scarborough Shoal will never be militarized. However, geospatial imagery dictates otherwise, because we could see there the existence of surface-to-air missiles in the artificial islands inside our sovereign territory. Suppose that we do not need the United States support. What is your policy prescription that will protect our national interest?
Well, am I heard? Okay. Number one, we talk about our sovereignty, but the others also have their position on their sovereignty over these areas. Number one. Number two, I often hear arbitration. But do you know that the United Nations stated specifically they have nothing to do with that arbitration exercise? Do you know that that arbitration court is not a court? Do you know that the Philippines and China both opted out of the compulsory arbitration, but yet the Philippines still push that? These are not known by even the best informed, in quotes, people that I expect to be informed. No, we are brainwashed by what I just pointed out, the information warfare. One of the questions included there is the allegation that China is engaged in deception, that China said that they would not install security structures in the area. Well, when it comes to national security, that's another matter, because the Americans have been very clear in 2011. They were shifting 60% of their military forces to Asia. That is called pivot to Asia. People must understand that. If you know the signals from these things, you know that the US is preparing for the 2025 war already. But the innocent and naive among our intelligentsia don't know these things, and they talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. Now, Scarborough incident. Who started it? Is it the Chinese? No, it's the Philippine. It's Noynoy Aquino arresting several Chinese fishing boats, and that spread like wildfire in Chinese social media, which pressured the government to take action also. Again, what is the error there in the Philippine side? We sent a naval ship, a gray ship, while China sent its white ships, Coast Guard. These are very important signals that nobody here, even the most intelligent and well-informed, again I say, notice, because they're not being informed by our mainstream media. Now, again, people here take the arbitration as gospel truth. That is not what the rest of the world thinks. So what are the other questions connected to that?
Yes, sir. So how do you think the Philippines should deal with this that can guarantee our national interest? Suppose
our national interest is to uplift our people from poverty. Our national interest, which has been slipping from our hands again and again through 3 generations, we failed to ride on the tiger phenomenon, the Asian tiger phenomenon. We were ahead in the 50s. We slipped again when the Japanese were offshoring their industries because of our politics and our inane nationalism that is so out of place. And I challenge all these anonymous texters questioning my nationalism or patriotism, because you are the ones who are not getting informed. And you, again and again, EDSA 1, when Marcos was already industrializing our country, we had EDSA 1 come in and disrupt that. Now that Marcos could have resumed that industrialization, he is reversing everything and protecting the oligarchs, when at least Marcos Sr. Dismantled some of the oligarchs like the Lopezes. But this fellow now in Malacanang is restoring it. Please control me if I go out of hand, but I'm speaking from my heart and from my knowledge, because this knowledge is so frustrating to see intellectuals who do not know the fundamentals about this Scarborough issue, about the arbitration and how much of it is a fraud. We paid 750 million pesos to American lawyers. What the hell? Don't we have the competent lawyers like Attorney Loja in this country? Maybe at that time, I don't know where Attorney Loja is. But we used American lawyers. It was a hoax. We were swindled by these American boys who kowtowed to these American lawyers. On and on and on for 10 years, I've been fighting this disinformation and fraud and hoaxes and so on. And you have self-righteous people questioning me who have maybe not even 10% of the knowledge they should have to comment on these things. But that's the Philippines. The loudest opinionated people are, taken seriously. Sorry if I'm going out of hand. Please control me.
Okay, sir. Well, very much heard.
Okay.
Now we understand. We see where you're coming from. Okay, thank you, sir. Now we have a question for Dr. Cabalza. Will the EDCA bases be used or not against China at any point in the future? What assurances can we have that will not be forced into a war against China with the presence of American military forces on the Philippine soil?
Okay, I'll try to be humble and honest here. Kasi umiinit na yung discussion po natin.
This needs a second round.
Yeah. I started my career as a defense researcher in 2006 at the National Defense College. I became a tenured professor, the youngest associate professor there in 2011 after my schooling in Beijing. And 2012, you have the issue of the Scarborough Shoal. Most of my students were eyewitnesses to the event. They had written it in their thesis at the NDCP. I was a panel to that. I was an advisor to some. And I listened to their narratives. I am an anthropologist, a security anthropologist. And that is the role of a security anthropologist. We listen to different perspectives and narratives. We advanced Philippine national interest. And we were pushed to the limit. We allowed the Chinese to be friends to us. But it seems like it's like an official business to them during the pandemic that they keep on expanding their maritime interest. We lost our sight. We felt like we could not ask anyone for help. We won our arbitration case. And now China is saying that that is a hoax. Then what kind of truth do we believe now? We thought that we did the right thing. We're trying to be diplomatic. We're asking the People's Liberation Army Navy to be gentle to us in the West Philippine Sea. But they're trying to be aggressive to us. We tried all the diplomatic means. We focused on bilateralism with China. We tried multilateralism with different like-minded nations. We experimented with different foreign policy, security policy, whatever resort mechanisms that we can resort to in order for us just to be good to our neighbor, to our giant neighbor. Pagod na po ang Pilipinas. Ano pa ba ang gusto ninyo sa amin? Ano pa ba? We're doing everything. to maintain our national interest and national security. We tried to be diplomatic, we tried to be emotional. You don't listen to us. What do you want from us? The EDCA sites, as I said earlier, is a way for us to shift our gear from internal security operations to territorial defense. Pagbigyan nyo naman yung Pilipinas na mag-external defense. 50 years we've been doing internal security operations. ISO lagi tayo, internal. Paano may external defense ng Pilipinas? If you care for the Philippines, allow us to exercise external defense. That is a sovereign right of the Philippines. Hindi po ito dahil sa Taiwan, dahil sa China, dahil sa US. This is for the Philippines. If you care for our country, allow it to happen. Thank you.
Okay, clear point, Dr. Cabalza. Thank you for that. And for Dr. Loha, there's a question here for you. Is there an alternative to EDCA? Duterte's pivot to China did not stop Beijing from encroaching in our waters. So how can we guarantee our national security and defend our sovereignty? Dr. Loha?
Thank you. The position paper that I submitted to the Senate is not about the scrapping of EDCA. It's about the revision of a specific provision to include the right of the Philippines to inspect types of weapons and to object to the introduction of certain types of weapons in Philippine territory. Now, we have to make sure that when we analyze EDCA, it is not isolated from the great power politics. We cannot be naive and parochial and think that EDCA is only about the defense of the Philippines against China. True that the motivations of the Philippines was to counter the expansion of China in the South China Sea at the time of the negotiations in 2014. But that is not the motivations of the United States. And it is clear in its RAND paper, it's clear in the statements of its officials. At the same time, we have to be historical in our analysis, not ahistorical, because from 2014, there has been a sea change. In 2019, the INF Treaty was scrapped. I'm talking again about the dismantling of the nuclear disarmament legal infrastructure. And therefore, there is no protection for the Philippines against the introduction of nuclear, conventional, and autonomous weapons with a range of 500 to 5,000, striking China, North Korea, etc. These developments have to be taken into account for purposes of revising the EDCA to protect us from any scenario in which the United States becomes involved in a shooting war with any foreign power, and the Philippines will be the first target because we are housing weapons of a belligerent state. Again, I repeat the reference to the Caroline Affair. The Caroline Affair is about the neutrality of a state and the loss of that neutrality and the legitimacy of an attack against that neutral state, simply because that neutral state allowed a belligerent state to make use of its territory or facilities or vessels to house weapons of that belligerent state. This is based in history, this is based in international law. And we also have to look at the history in Cuba, in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The parallelism is very striking. We invoke deterrence. Cuba invoked deterrence. What did the US listen to Cuba? No. The US invoked the Monroe Doctrine and said that if you will not remove those missiles from your territory, we are going to choke you off. Naval blockade, naval quarantine. The same in the Philippine situation. China does not listen to our invocation of deterrence because, as I said, in the concept of security dilemma in international relations, for China, what we did is not simple deterrent. It is a security threat to China. And the purpose of these types of forum is for us to think of a way to break the dynamic, the dangerous dynamic, which could lead, as Mersheimer, as Graham Allison said, which could lead to a Thucydides war. That is our role as academics, to break that dynamic. And that is why we are here talking about scenarios, talking about options for the Philippines. And I do take exception to the reactor who did not listen to the entire proceeding and said that we are not talking about the interest of the Philippines, when exactly the discussion revolved around whether it is to the interest of the Philippines to maintain EDCA as it is, or to merely revise it, or to scrap it. That was the discussion was all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Loha. A very important lesson worth pondering upon, really. Thank you for that insight. Okay, we have a lot of questions here, but we don't have the luxury of time to accommodate all your questions. I think now the Asian Center is thinking about doing another round of roundtable discussion in the near future. So thank you very much to our speakers, Dr. Loha, Dr. Cabalsa, Sir Laurel, and Dr. Chan, for your very interesting insights on EDCA. It has been truly an animated, an informative, a lively, and even riveting exchange of ideas here. Okay, so at this point, we shall listen to the Assistant Dean for Public Affairs of the UP Asian Center, Dr. Maria Antoinette Raquiza, for the closing remarks. Dr. Raquiza?
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the speakers, the reactor, and of course also Noel, Dr. Boratilia, who organized this forum, and our moderator, Dr. Palumbarit. I actually would like to go back, and I beg to disagree with Dr. Loha, because I do appreciate or understand what the reactor meant, which was, let's start with what is the Philippine interest, right? Because we did go into all sorts of, this is China and this is US, and that are all very valid points that need to be taken into account when we actually go into what the Philippines should do, even beyond, and I think even beyond the EDCA issue as it is. And one of the things that I think is critical is the fact that we still do not have a real discussion on what do we do, how do we advance the West Philippine Sea / South China Sea debacle that we have. And I think if ever we do have a second round, we need to actually start there. Because I know that it is a contested, it is a highly debate, there's a emotional, ideological debate that revolves around the West Philippine Sea issue. I do also would like to say that, of course, in terms of what the discussion is, and I'm not going to anymore add, because I think we've exhausted the issues. And we've also brought out a lot of the different approaches, perspectives on the issues. And I'd like to thank everyone who had contributed. With that, maraming salamat sa lahat. The Asian Center is happy to be able to provide this kind of a forum for different opinions. And I think we did at the end have a balance, more or less a balanced appreciation of what confronts us as a country. We do want to really push for an independent foreign policy, right? And if we are actually after an independent foreign policy, we do need to take into account what actually are the underlying interests of the Filipino people. And I think we are able to get bits and pieces that has been already been discussed here. So again, magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, Dr. Raquiza. Thank you very much. Thank to our resource persons, Dr. Loha, Dr. Cabalsa, Sir Laurel, and Dr. Chan. We really appreciate your insightful and very passionate comments on the matter. I'm confident that the event this afternoon has provided us with very cherished knowledge and opinions on a very timely issue. But what is more important really is that we, meaning government and the general public, will take action that will ultimately benefit our country. So congratulations, and thank you to Dr. Moratilla for organizing this event, to the Asian Center. Please subscribe to the Asian Center website. We have a lot of important discussions and webinars for you. This has been really a great discussion. Probably there will be another one in the near future. So thank you to all our attendees, to all our resource persons. Thank you very much. This has been your MC, Michelle Palumbarit, and see you around. Ingat po tayong lahat.
Thank you, Sheshe.
Thank you.
Ma'am, maybe we can take a picture, quick picture.
Oh, okay. Chester.
Yeah. I'm still here. Picture
Okay.
daw?
Sir Laurel, Dr. Chan, and Amloha, Tonet too.
Okay, so
Nawala
let me
Nawala
take
yung-
it.
Nawala yung iba.
All right, so 1, 2, 3, smile. Again. 1, 2, 3, smile. Thank you.
Thank you. Maraming salamat.
Thank you.
Salamat po.
Thank you, Sir Henry.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.